Hello everyone, I'm John Martinez back here with another Blender tutorial. This one's going to be a little bit shorter than my usual longer full-length tutorials, but it's going to be still not that short. Anyways, today we are going to be making this little nanobot liquid metal sentient AI fluid thing. I don't know, it looks really sci-fi. I thought it looked pretty cool, so that's what we're going to be doing today. This one's going to be a little bit less structured than usual because working with these fluid simulations, things can get a little bit weird, especially when you're dealing with all these forces to get these complex shapes and everything. So if yours looks different from mine in a significant way, don't worry about it. It's just, making small changes can affect the final look of it quite a bit. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So here we are in a new Blender project, and the first thing I'm going to do is press save, so that way in case Blender crashes, then it will go ahead and save it for us. We're going to call this the nano-fluid tutorial because why not? It's a little bit descriptive. And the default cube here, this is going to be our fluid domain, that our little box that the fluid's going to be bouncing around in that you saw in the little intro clip. And then we're going to be adding in a little, icosphere, UV sphere, cube, whatever you want to. It doesn't really matter. You can add a monkey if you wanted to. I'm just going to do an icosphere. So we're going to up the resolution just so I can have a little bit more to work with and shrink it down a little bit. And you can see the outline of the sphere inside of our cube right now, but I really don't want to be working where I can't see what I'm doing. So we'll just switch on over to wireframe view up here at top. And then now we can actually see what we're doing and see if it's still within the bounds of our cube. Let's tab over to edit mode on our icosphere, switch it to vertex mode if you aren't already there. And then just click on random vertices, press O to engage the proportional editing, or click up here at the top, and then just start moving things around a little bit. It doesn't really matter. We're just trying to give it some sort of interesting shape. So that way when we're starting with our fluid simulation, it's not going to be, just a sphere that everything is working on. And, we're going to add a little bit of a force in the beginning to kind of squish everything down towards the middle. And if you start with just a perfect sphere, there's not really going to be any motion. So that's why we're just kind of giving it a little bit of shape to kind of give it a little bit of motion, something like this. And then if we switch out of wireframe mode, you can see that it's sticking out a little bit. So we'll just tab into edit mode and move that up a little bit so that's inside of our cube. And now everything is contained within the cube, and we can start actually adding in our physics to this. And before I forget, because I've already forgotten, I will enable screencast keys for you so that you can actually see what I'm doing. Let's add in our physics properties. First, we'll do our domain. We'll go ahead and head over to the physics properties tab right there. Click on fluid, change this one to domain, and then switch it from gas to liquid. That's very important. And for some reason, that just makes the cube fill back in. I don't know why. It's kind of irritating, but what can you do? Then we'll head on over to our icosphere. You can see I've got it highlighted now. Then we'll set this one to fluid flow, change it to liquid as well so that it matches, and then leave it on geometry because we don't want it to be, an inflow, because otherwise it'll just fill up our cube until there's no room for anything interesting to be happening. One final thing before we can actually kind of take a look at this, head on over to the field weights of our domain. So click on your cube and then either press A or just click on the drop down to open up your field weights and turn off gravity, because if you don't do that, then it'll just kind of fall to the bottom and start filling it up from the bottom there. And one final thing, we're going to switch our cache. We will call this, what do we want to call this? Fluid tutorial. So it's saved in the same area as my project files. Always a little bit better as well. I don't want to do 250. We'll do 150 for our number of frames right there. We'll switch our simulation into 150 as well. And you can leave it on replay. It's a little bit faster that way if you want to just actually look at what you're doing. But switching this to all gives you more stable results. So let's just do it. I'll just show you kind of what we've got going so far. It'll bake really fast because we've got absolutely nothing going on here. And then if we do that and switch over to wireframe, you can actually kind of see what's going on. Absolutely nothing. And that is because there are zero forces. The only force in this scene at all is gravity, which we've disabled for our fluid. So now nothing happens. Congratulations. You've successfully created whatever this thing is. And let's go ahead and actually enable mesh while we're at it. And this way, when we actually start doing things, it won't just be all these random dots. It'll actually create a mesh here. So let's free all, bake all. It'll bake a little bit slower because it's creating a mesh to go along with what we're doing. But this way we can actually kind of see what we're doing without having to be in wireframe mode like this. So if we switch back over to solid view mode, and let's hide our icosphere that we've created because now it doesn't really serve a purpose. We play through and nothing's still happening, obviously. So let's add in some forces and look at how that's kind of affecting what we're doing. If we put in a positive force like this, what it's going to do is start pushing out away in all directions from the center of the force like this, which we don't really want, because if we do that, then our little cube domain that we have here, you know, our little box, all the fluid's going to get pushed out here to the edge, and then it's just going to kind of be pulling up along the edges, which isn't the effect that we want. So what we want is to actually change this to a negative number like that, and then you can actually kind of start to see how that's going to affect things once I actually render this out at all. So we'll go here, we'll free all, and then bake it. And let's see how this reacts this time. Now it should kind of squish everything inwards a little bit. And then because we've created that irregular shape through our modeling, then it will give you, you know, some motion. It may not be very interesting motion, but if we play through it, now you can see that there's actually something going on here. And you can see that, you know, it kind of turns into a sphere. If we were actually to, you know, run this simulation for a lot longer, wow, this is so weird. I've never seen this before. If we were to run the simulation for a lot longer, it would actually just turn into a sphere and kind of eventually settle down, which we don't want. We want it to kind of continue moving and having these interesting shapes and all of that stuff. So we're gonna have to add in some variations to this main force that we have here, and we're gonna add in a little bit of extra forces as well. So let's start with just adding in some variation to our main force right here. We can add in a keyframe by pressing I while hovering over the strength. And then if we head over to the animation tab and then switch this down here to our graph editor, then you can actually add in some variation to it from here. If you press in, that brings up this menu right here. In fact, let me enable screencast keys here because I have to enable it everywhere, it seems like. There we go. All right, so if you press in while down here hovering over the graph editor, you can see where there's this modifiers tab. So if we go there and then add in a noise modifier, it's going to add in a little bit of variation to the strength of our force field right here. So now we can see how as we go through different frames, it's changing like that. So what we want to do is just add in a little bit of variation, but not so much that it just kind of turns this into pure chaos. If you add in too much variation and make the variation too big, then it'll just kind of turn into a big mess, and that's what we're trying to avoid here. So let's zoom in. If you hold control while right mouse dragging, you can kind of zoom in on either the X or the Y axis. A little bit of navigational tip there for you. So right now it looks like it's kind of varying between like 0.5 and 1.5. Obviously it's all negative. So let's just bump up the strength a little bit. There's quite a bit of variation here, you know, maybe down to -2. We don't want it to ever get above 0, so we'll change that in a second. And then this scale slider right here changes, you know, how far over time it's spread out. So, you know, we're trying random values. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. That's the thing about this particular effect, is that it requires re-rendering a lot, or rebaking your fluid simulation quite a bit. So right here, we're just going to set a limit. I added another modifier and then just added a limit. And then we're going to set a maximum Y value, and it defaults to 0, which is what we want. We want to clamp it at 0 so it doesn't ever start pushing away. We just want it to only be pulling in. And now if we go ahead and free our bake on our fluid, so we go here, free all, and that clears away, you know, the data that we have calculated for that. And then we bake all. All right, so if we look at that, and let's actually click onto our force field while we're watching this, just so we can see how the variation in the force strength affects the change of, or the shape of the fluid. So you see it's a little bit more complex than it was before. Just a little bit, not a whole lot. In fact, what I think I'm going to do is increase the strength of this force a little bit, you know, in the negative direction. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, bump up the strength of our noise so it's a little bit more like that. And then while I'm hovering over here, I'm going to press G and then Y, and then that allows me to kind of change the displacement of this function. I'm not sure if that's the right word. And then I can just move it down just a little bit, something like that. We could recalculate this and everything as is. It's not really going to change it a whole lot. So first thing we're going to do is actually just add in some other forces. And here's where, you know, the creativity starts coming into play. You could add in, say, maybe a turbulence force. Let's do that. Let's just add in a turbulence, bump it up like that, bump up the strength to 3. I don't know how this is going to be affecting what's going on. And we'll change the size to, I don't know, 0.5, something like that. And let's just add in, I don't know, a rotation as well to this. So we'll go ahead and just click here, add in hashtag frame divided by, I don't know, 20. We'll make this hashtag frame divided by 20. So now this adds in a little bit of rotation to it, this driver that we've just created. It'll take the frame that we're on, in this case frame 99, divide it by 20, and then convert that to the rotation. And then now it just gets a little bit of rotation in there. So we've done that. Let's just go ahead and check that. Let's go ahead and see how that affects what we're doing so far. Again, free all, bake all, wait another 30 seconds for it to bake, and then we'll see how that looks a little bit different, if it looks different at all. I don't know how it's going to look. That's the thing about this particular one, is that it's going to be a lot of baking, rebaking, all that stuff. There's not really a kind of a technique to this. Okay, so it's finished baking, and first thing we notice is that it looks like the fluid is a square, and the reason for that is because what I mentioned before, the simulation has kind of decayed a little bit. So if we go out to the beginning, it looks fine, it looks how we expect it to, but then it very quickly devolves into just a mess like that. And that is because we've now added in too much variation here. So let's just change this, bump it down quite a bit, just to 0.1 like that, free all, and I'll skip the baking right here. All right, so this looks a little bit better. At least it's not pure chaos. And now you see we're getting a lot more complex and interesting shapes here. And that, you know, that looks pretty good. I like the way it's kind of like pulsing a little bit. You can see how it's kind of going out and then going back in. And that is, I think, going to be related a lot to the initial force field that we've done, the kind of center of self force field, the cohesive force. It looks like the pulsing of this is really dependent on that a little bit. So that looks pretty good to me, actually. Let me actually just add in a cube because, you know, we're gonna have this inside of a little box, sort of. So we'll just add in our box. We'll switch this one over to wireframe as well. And then that way we can kind of see how this is interacting, you know, how much it's filling up this box. And right now, I think it's filling it up a little bit too much. I think there's too much material inside of this box. So let's just go to frame 1 and bring back our icosphere. Let's rename this icosphere first of all to fluid emitter, and then our fluid domain here, we're going to call this the fluid domain. So now we can actually kind of see which one we're clicking on at any given moment. So our fluid emitter, let's just shrink it down a little bit so that there's less material inside here that we're going to be working with. I think we can stand to bump up the strength of the turbulence a little bit. So I clicked on the turbulence. Let's bump up the strength to say 0.15, just a little bit to kind of give it a little bit more variation. We will free all, and I'll skip this again. All right, so now if we play this, you can see that we're getting a little bit more. Okay. You can see it we almost lost control there for a second. It kind of splashed out like that. That actually looks pretty good. So this is, you know, it's a really delicate balance here. We want it to kind of have this chaotic nature to it, but we want to keep it reined in a little bit so that it's not just turning into that chaos that we saw earlier. So I think this is actually a pretty good, you know, combination, that balance right there. It's getting a lot of really interesting motion. It's kind of pulsing. I like the way it looks. So what we're going to do is we're going to pause, go back to the beginning. Let's go back on over to the layout tab so it's a little bit bigger. So let's free our bake and then bump up the resolution to, I don't know, 100, and then we'll bake it again and see how that looks. Switching between low and high resolution while working on this sort of thing is actually a little bit difficult because there is a lot of complex motion. Sometimes what works at a lower resolution might actually kind of be crossing that threshold in the higher resolution. You know, take what you're doing at low resolutions with a grain of salt. When you actually start bumping it up to, say, production quality resolutions, it may look really bad. So using these intermediate resolutions is a good way of checking if the forces that you have are going to work at these higher resolutions before you commit to the multiple hours long baking times that come with, you know, a resolution of 256 or whatever else. So that's why we're going to be doing a 100. It's going to take a little bit longer. I'm just going to fast forward through the rest of this baking time and come back to you when it's done. Now that the fluid bake is done, let's actually play through this and see how it's looking. I'm getting a lot more detail, obviously, since we've added that in. You can see how it's, Oh, it looks like it's about to turn into pure chaos. Hopefully can manage to hold on a little bit until the end. I don't know. This may be a little bit too chaotic for my taste, in which case this is why we do the medium resolution bakes, because yeah, this is not going to work. This is a mess right here. Yeah, that's no good. That's no good. Unfortunately, 8 minutes later, we learned that this is garbage. We don't like this. Joy. Okay, we're gonna come back into our turbulence, bump down the strength, because I believe the turbulence is what was causing all of our issues. So yeah, turbulence is way too strong for this. I don't know. Really nothing I can do other than freeing the bake and trying again. I'll see you all in 10 minutes. So here we are on day 2. I know I skipped over a lot of stuff, but that's because I went through like a billion different iterations of this thing. Like you can see on your screen right here, each one progressively failing for some reason or another before I eventually settled on this final version right here, which I then baked at 100 resolution, so that way I can actually make sure it's working. Anyways, a lot of different versions because everything just kind of seemed to explode into complete chaos and just had to rein it back in a little bit. So here's what I actually did to get to that point. So we'll look at our main force right here, go over to the animation tab. First thing I did was kind of change the average value right here to -1 by just, G moving it up and down like that. And then I added in this restrict frame range setting right there on our noise modifier. So that way, as it's going towards the end, it kind of just tapers off and becomes more of a constant force, because otherwise it kind of, just flings it all around as the force increases and decreases, and it was a mess. So I added that in there. And also I took our turbulence force that we have, and then it's kind of hard to see right there. I faded that out a little bit. We had it at kind of a really low value to begin with, but then it was still just kind of messing things up a little bit. So I just faded that out as well. And those are really the only 2 changes I ended up needing to make. Of course, there were a lot of variations on those changes before I settled on these values, but that's just kind of what I eventually ended up with. And I'm sorry to tell you, but if you're going to do this, you're going to probably end up having to do the exact same thing, having to make small changes, rendering out or baking your fluid simulation, then seeing how that affects it, make another small change. Really, just changing this end value right here from 100 to 90, actually a pretty big difference. So it's a lot of really small changes. Anyways, the fluid simulation is kind of looking how I want it to, so I will go ahead and do all the materials, the box, all that stuff right now. And then at the very end of this, we'll actually switch over to a much higher resolution. I'm gonna do 400. We will bake that. It will take an extremely long time, and then we'll be able to render out the final scene right here as well. So let's go ahead and get started on our little box that we're going to be creating here. We already kind of have this outline that we created before. So let's just rename this to box and then head on over to our modifiers tab. First thing we're going to do is add in a solidify modifier, and this will kind of give it a little bit of thickness inside. If we kind of zoom in, you can kind of see how it's doing that a little bit. So the way that we're going to do this is by actually just coming over to some random frame where the fluid is hitting the wall like that, and then we'll head over to one of our side views like this, and then just increase the thickness until it's like about touching the fluid a little bit. And that'll give you the appropriate thickness level. And then from there, to finish kind of modeling out our box, we are going to add in a bevel modifier. This is, really quite a simple little box that we're making here. Let's increase our segments by quite a bit. I don't know, maybe 10, something like that. And then decrease the spread, like that, the amount of beveling. Something like that. It's probably going to be fine. Let's go ahead and head over to here and change this display to solid, and now it'll just cover everything up. This is why we had it not on that before, but now we can actually start working on materials. So before we do that, let's head over to our render properties right here, switch over to cycles, GPU, because that's what we do in this channel. We use cycles only, and then head over to the shading tab, come over here, switch it over to the actual rendered view. And while we have our cube selected, let's click new material, change this to a glass BSDF. So delete the principal BSDF and then go ahead and connect our glass BSDF. And now we have a little glass box that our fluid is contained in. And you can do whatever you want to with this. On a different version of this setup I have here, I actually I duplicated the cube and used a wireframe modifier to kind of create this kind of outline of the box, and then made that into a metal material. It looked pretty cool, but for this particular one, I like the look of just having this solid, you know, glass, acrylic, whatever you want to call it, box here that we're going to use for this. And then just so you can kind of get this interesting little dispersion effect from the curvature of the glass. And that's why, you know, we had to use such a high amount on our bevel, high number of segments, because even with 10 segments, you can still see that. And we can get around that by just shading smooth. And that fixes it pretty good. I don't really think you can reduce the number of segments, and then it starts behaving a little bit weird when you look at it in this corner right here when you have lower number of segments. So the higher that number is, the more accurate that's going to look. So I think 10 is probably a pretty decent number. It's not really going to slow it down a whole lot here, I don't think. Let's see. Yeah, it doesn't really change a whole lot there. Anyways, that's pretty good. Our glass material is good. Our index of refraction, I'm just going to change this to 1.6. I think that's the index of refraction of acrylic. Whatever it is, you can figure out what you want, or you can just leave it at the default. I just like that look. So that's good. Our little glass box is good. And then to kind of keep the performance of the rendering going decent, I'm going to hide our glass box, and we can work on our fluid here. This one also really simple. You're just going to change this to a metallic shader and bring down the roughness so that it's very liquid-like. So let's go ahead and shade this one smooth. And it doesn't look that great because we're just doing this with the default scene here. We're not actually doing anything with the HDRI or anything like that. So if you want to, you can build a whole scene around this, a room, everything, whatever you want to for that, and light it that way. Or, just for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just going to go ahead and use an HDRI just because it's easier. And then I'll probably add in a floor on top of that. So let's go ahead and open, and let's head over to our HDRIs tab. Oh, I don't know. Any one of these will probably work. Let's see. I don't even know what these actually are. Yeah, this one looks fine to me. I like this HDRI. Don't know where I got it. Probably HDRI Haven. So that looks pretty good. And our material here for our metal fluid thing, it looks pretty good. So let's actually just darken it up a little bit. And then here, just darken it to taste. Maybe, if you want to, give it a little bit of a blue tint to it. So obviously that's too much. I do this, I like drag it all the way out, find the hue that I want, for like HSV, hue saturation value. I find the hue that looks pretty good, and then I just drag the saturation all the way back down, and then just add it in a little bit until I kind of like the look. Subtle difference. That looks pretty good to me. So let's look at our box with that a little bit as well. That looks pretty good. Hide the box one more time. And let's just add in a floor real quick, because why not? Let's move this down by -1, and that should put it at the same level as our box, like that. And then we'll scale it all the way up. And now we have a floor. You know what? While we're at it, I'm already doing this, let's just go ahead and build a really simple room to go along with this cube. Move this along the y-axis, then the x-axis, head into edit mode and select these two edges right here. Not that. Extrude vertically like that, and let's just scale it along the y-axis and move it over. Something like this. And that way, there's a little bit something. Maybe it's like a very clinical laboratory setting. Laboratory, yeah, that's right, I said it. Otherwise, just hide your floor thing or whatever, I don't know. So that's just how we actually make the materials for this. And then the beveling on our cube looks pretty good to me. Maybe we can see what it looks like if I bump that up to 0.02. Not a whole lot of difference. One of the things that you'll notice though is the reason why we're doing a bevel, and like especially a rather large bevel rather than something really small like 0.001 or whatever, is because of the way glass shaders are rendered in here. It actually creates kind of this dark outline. I don't know if that's physically accurate or not. These dark outline on where the two sides intersect. So in order to kind of minimize that, then I round it out quite a bit, and that just gives it a more interesting, pleasing look to me anyways. So anyways, that is how we create our material for our little box and all that stuff. Put it in whatever scene you want to. It looks pretty good to me. So let's just go ahead and render this out at higher resolution. Let's switch this back over. Let's just go to wireframe mode. So let's just go ahead and render this out at higher resolution, and I will come back to you when it is done. So here we are 15 hours, yes, I said hours later, with a 400 resolution fluid simulation. And I've actually, put this into a different project file just in case something didn't work out, and I'm rendering it to a different folder as well, so that way in case something happened I would not lose everything that I worked with before, because I did not want to have to redo this again for 15 more hours. Anyways, all of our materials are here. If we switch over to our material tab, then you can see how we have an extremely high resolution fluid simulation right here. I've kind of actually modified things a little bit. I've made the glass wall a little bit thinner, but I think we can actually make it a little bit thicker. Let's bump this up to 0.02. So I'll just go ahead and render this out as a full, animation here. I think, let's see if I hide that, and what does it look like if I think I'll leave the plane in here just so we can have something against which to have our little thing here. Let's add an empty real quick so that way we can have our empty. When you have such high resolution, it takes a long time. So we have our empty in here. We're going to parent the camera to the empty. Select the empty by pressing Control P, parent it, and then let's head over to frame 1. You can see how long it takes to actually do this now. Take our empty and rotate our camera. So it's something along like that maybe. We will keyframe the rotation of our empty, and then head over to the final frame and keyframe the rotation there, and hope that we are not rotating too fast, because there is absolutely no way of checking this. Actually, there is. If we take our fluid domain, bump that into a collection. Here's a little pro tip for you. If you have a fluid or any simulation that is slowing down your entire scene right here so that you can't play through anything in real time, and if you just hide it, then it still takes a decade and a half to actually do anything. I press play right now and it's not doing anything. But if you want to actually make it so that you can play through, if you put it into a collection and then just disable the collection with that check mark right there, then Blender just completely ignores that collection entirely. So this looks pretty good to me. Let's change this to 30 frames per second because we're on the internet, and that is what you do on the internet. So this looks like a pretty good speed to me, and you can imagine the fluid in here. That looks pretty good. So let's re-enable our collection. We will set our render destination to, let's go to Documents, Blender, and just set a fluid tutorial render. We'll save it to fluid tutorial render, and we'll just rename this to yay, it's done. Can't do apostrophes, so it is done. Do that. We'll switch it to PNG that way in case something goes wrong while we're rendering it, then it will still be there. It's not gonna just cut off and then I'll have to re-render the whole thing. It'd be really a big hassle. Let's bump this up to 80%. That doesn't really matter a whole lot. I'm not time constrained. And let's see, that's gonna be pretty good. That'll all be good. 4096, that's a good resolution or sample rate. Resolution's good. 30 frames per second doesn't matter, I guess, because we're doing PNG. Make sure, of course, that everything you want to render is enabled as rendering and everything you don't want to render is disabled. So I will just go ahead and press render for real this time. And this will be what you see at the beginning of the video. So I guess that's all I've got for you right now. I hope you enjoyed the video and found something useful to do with it. And maybe you can make your own cool little sentient evil fluids or whatever. Anyways, that's all for now. I'm John Martinez, and this has been Learn Together Filmmaking.